For 3 years, Caleb Mercer had lived in silence. No neighbors, no law, no questions. He tended his cattle, mended his fences, and wrote letters to a woman he'd never met. A woman named Catherine Morrison, who was supposed to arrive that very evening. He had prepared the cabin, shaved his beard, and polished his boots as if by cleaning the surface he could hide what lay underneath. But as the sound of distant hoofbeats broke through the stillness, Caleb sensed something was wrong. These weren't the frenzied sounds of raiders or traders. They were measured, intentional. And there was only one horse. The rider appeared just beyond the ridge. A young Kiowa warrior, not yet 20 by the look of him, with war paint streaked across his face. His horse was slow, deliberate. He carried no visible weapon, only a long stick bearing a white cloth. A flag of truce. Caleb stepped off the porch, rifle slung but not raised. The air was heavy. Even the cattle stood still. The young man stopped 50 yards away and called out, "Caleb Mercer, we need to talk." The name struck Caleb like a slap. It had been years since anyone had used it out loud. Out here he was just the rancher, the quiet one in Cedar Hollow. He narrowed his eyes. Talk about what the warrior's voice was calm. About the woman you're waiting for. And about the choice you'll soon have to make. Caleb said nothing. The warrior stepped down from his horse and pulled a folded paper from a leather pouch. He placed it on the ground between them, then stepped back. "Catherine Morrison," he said, "died of fever in Kansas City 3 weeks ago." Caleb stared at the paper. He didn't need to read it. He knew it was real. The letters, the ones that had brought light to his days and warmth to his lonely nights, were a lie. "Then who's on that stagecoach?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who needs you to believe she's Catherine. Someone you've met before, though you don't remember her." Caleb's mind raced. The letters had been perfect. Too perfect. She never asked questions about his land, his past. She'd accepted everything about him without hesitation. No real woman would have done that, not without curiosity. And then, memory began to crack through the surface. He remembered the badge, the posse, the chaos in Deadwood Creek. A raid gone wrong. Innocent people caught in the crossfire. A family destroyed. A name surfaced like a long-buried secret: Sarah Morrison. The girl who survived. The girl whose life he'd ruined with a reckless chase and a quick trigger. The warrior spoke again. "She hired us to make sure you can't run. She wants to look you in the eye when she tells you who she really is." And just like that, the past Caleb had tried to bury stood waiting at the edge of the valley, riding in on wheels, wearing his guilt like a mask. And there was no place left to hide. The stagecoach arrived just as the sun slipped behind the canyon wall, casting a long shadow over Caleb Mercer's porch. Dust trailed behind the horses, curling through the evening air like smoke from a dying fire. The driver reined in the team and tipped his hat toward the cabin. "Delivery for Mr. Mercer," he called cheerfully. "Got your bride here safe and sound." Safe and sound. The words felt cruel now. Caleb stood, frozen hands loose at his sides. Behind him, the young Kiowa brave remained still, watching silently from horseback. He had no need to speak anymore. What came next would say everything. The stagecoach door creaked open. A woman stepped out, one hand on the brass handle, the other lifting the hem of a modest traveling dress. She was tall, slender, her posture rigid. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe bun, her face sharp with focus, not softness. But it was her eyes, piercing icy blue, that brought Caleb to his knees inside. She looked nothing like the woman he'd imagined. Nothing like the gentle voice behind the letters. The driver, oblivious to the weight of the moment, hopped down and began unloading her trunk, chattering about weather and trail conditions. She nodded politely, even smiled. but it didn't touch her eyes. When the coach finally disappeared down the road and the dust began to settle, she turned toward Caleb. Her entire expression changed. Gone was the pleasant facade. What remained was colder, purposeful, a steel edge honed over years. "Hello, Sheriff Mercer," she said. Her voice was low and steady. Caleb didn't correct her. He couldn't. He just stared. "Or do you prefer Caleb now?" she continued. "I suppose men like you change names as easily as they change towns." She took a few slow steps forward, her boots crunching on gravel. "You don't recognize me yet. That's all right. I've had time to change, but I remember everything about you." Caleb's throat tightened. "Sarah," she nodded once. 12 years old, hiding behind my father's wagon in Deadwood Creek, while you and your deputies fired blindly into our trading post. Do you remember what you said to me afterward?" He didn't answer. "You said, 'These things happen out here. Sorry about your folks.'" Her mouth twisted, like it was weather, like it was a storm we were supposed to live through. He looked down at his boots. The same boots he'd polished that morning, thinking he was preparing for a new beginning. Instead, he had been dressing for a reckoning. Sarah reached into her travel bag and pulled out a small wooden box. Caleb recognized it instantly. It had belonged to her father, Thomas Morrison, the man Caleb had once sworn to protect. She opened it, revealing yellowed letters, official documents, and a glint of metal. "You want to know who wrote those letters?" she asked. "Who told you she was Catherine Morrison?" "It was me." I learned her voice, studied her handwriting. "I spent 2 years making you believe she was alive, so I could be the one to meet you." Caleb's voice cracked. "Why go through all this? You could have sent a bullet." Sarah stepped closer. "Because a bullet is easy. I wanted you to hope, to believe you were forgiven, that maybe, just maybe, the past had forgotten you. And then I wanted to take it all away." She stared at him now, not with rage, but with something far more dangerous clarity. "You ruined my family, Caleb. But I'm not here just for revenge. I'm here to make sure you finally understand what you did. And then when you do..." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle like dust on dry earth. "You're going to help me finish what you started. Or you'll die in this valley forgotten, like the people you left behind." The wind picked up again, whispering through the canyon, stirring the dust that refused to settle. And Caleb Mercer, once a lawman now, just a man trying to outrun his shame, realized the truth. The woman standing before him wasn't his bride. She was his sentence. Caleb Mercer didn't reach for his rifle. Not because he wasn't afraid he was, but because he knew it wouldn't change anything. Sarah Morrison stood 10 feet from his porch with 3 years of fury carved into her voice and posture. Around them, the silent presence of the Kiowa warriors reminded him that running was no longer an option. Every exit from Cedar Hollow was blocked. Every path he might take led through her. She pulled a folded paper from her father's wooden box and handed it to him. Her hands didn't shake. His did. It was a wanted poster, old but familiar. The faces stared back at him like ghosts. The Garrett gang, the same outlaws he'd chased into Deadwood Creek, the same men he'd sworn to bring to justice, the same men he never caught. 14 people, she said quietly. "That's how many they've killed since the day you gave up the chase." Caleb didn't look up. The numbers hit him harder than any bullet could. He had told himself he walked away from the badge out of shame, that he was unfit to enforce the law after what happened to the Morrison family. But now, he saw the truth. He hadn't stepped away. He'd run. Sarah's voice cut through the silence. "You didn't just kill my family that day. You let others die after. You abandoned your job and called it penance." She placed a second document into his hands. This one was a territorial warrant, still active, still binding, calling for the arrest or elimination of the Garrett gang. "I tracked them myself," she said. "Took me 3 years. I found them. I watched, I waited. But I can't stop them alone." Caleb looked up at her hollow. "Then why the letters? Why pretend to be Catherine?" "Because you wouldn't have come for me," she answered. "But you'd prepare for a bride. You'd clean yourself up, make the bed, be ready to face someone new." She paused, eyes narrowing. "And I wanted to see what that looked like, the man who destroyed my family, dressing himself like he deserved a second chance." Caleb felt his throat tighten. "You could have killed me." "I thought about it," she admitted. "More than once. But what's the point of revenge if it doesn't change anything? Killing you wouldn't bring back my sister. But forcing you to carry their memory to act on it, that might save someone else." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the edge of grief hiding behind her fury. "The Garrett gang is planning to hit a train next week. A children's train. 43 orphans on board. No guards. Just a strong box of adoption payments and a tight schedule." Caleb's eyes widened. "A train of children?" She nodded. "The stop is called Millfield. No lawmen for 50 miles. Perfect for an ambush." Behind her, the Kiowa brave spoke for the first time. "We tried to warn the marshals, but they don't listen to us." Caleb looked from the warrior back to Sarah. He understood now. This wasn't just personal. It was bigger. A chance to stop something before it happened. A chance to stop being the man who arrived too late. Sarah pulled a final telegram from her coat. The paper was creased, the ink faint, but the message was clear. "Millfield water stop confirmed. Children on board. Payment strongbox intact. Garrett plans moving forward. No interference expected." Her eyes met his. "You still have your badge, Caleb?" He hesitated, then slowly nodded. "In a tin under the stove." She didn't smile, but something in her eyes changed. "Then it's time to dig it out." Caleb Mercer turned toward the cabin. His legs were heavy, his heart heavier still. But the sound of children's laughter, distant, imagined, carried on the wind. He hadn't worn the badge in 3 years. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to earn it again. The badge felt colder than Caleb Mercer remembered. He hadn't touched it since the day he threw it into an old coffee tin and buried it under the cabin floorboards. A small grave for a part of himself he hoped would never surface again. But now, as he pinned it back to his chest, the weight of it settled into his bones like an old truth reclaimed. Sarah Morrison stood at the doorway, arms crossed, rifle slung across her shoulder. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything. This wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't about him. It was about those children. In 4 days, a train carrying 43 orphans would pass through an isolated water stop in Millfield. No deputies, no marshal, no help, and the Garrett gang would be waiting. They won't just steal the strongbox, Sarah had said earlier, voice tight with fury. They'll kill everyone on board. Children. Just like I was. The Kiowa warrior running elk had nodded solemnly. We've seen what happens when law fails to act. We've buried enough of our own. Now the sun dipped below the ridgeline, casting long blue shadows across Cedar Hollow. Caleb emerged from the cabin with a rifle strapped across his back and 2 loaded revolvers at his waist. He was no longer the hermit who raised cattle and read old letters. He stood straighter now, though the weight of the years hadn't lessened. I'll ride, he said. Not because I expect to be forgiven, but because those kids deserve to live more than I deserve to forget. Sarah gave a single nod, tight and purposeful. We leave now. We can reach Millfield in 3 days if we move hard. Within the hour, preparations were done. The Kiowa warriors emerged from the cliffs like shadows pulling into formation, not raiders, but guardians. Quiet, alert, and ready. A force bound not by blood, but by purpose. The unlikely company set out as night fell: a former sheriff, a woman forged by tragedy, and a war party once feared across the frontier. Together they rode for the same cause: to stop a massacre before it ever began. The trail to Millfield would not be easy. The land was rough, the weather uncertain, and every mile held the risk of ambush or resistance. Settlements along the way might see the warriors as a threat, not protectors. But they didn't turn back. For the first few miles, the only sound was the rhythmic clatter of hooves. Then Sarah broke the silence. "My father always said a good man isn't one who never fails," she said, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "It's the man who owns what he's broken and tries to mend it even when it costs him everything." Caleb didn't answer, but the words sat with him. He knew he couldn't bring her family back, couldn't erase the horrors of Deadwood Creek. But perhaps this once he could stand between the innocent and the barrel of a gun. And maybe that would be enough. As they crested a ridge, the valley below opened wide, dry grasslands, stretching to the horizon, framed by the jagged spines of distant peaks. Somewhere out there, the Garrett gang was preparing for blood. But so were they. The true mission wasn't revenge. It wasn't redemption. It was to ensure that when the children's train rolled into Millfield, it wouldn't meet death. It would meet justice. Caleb spurred his horse forward, dust curling in his wake. The ride to redemption had begun. They rode hard for 3 days. Through wind-whipped plains and narrow canyons where the sun barely touched the dirt, their small party pressed forward, united by urgency, if not by history. At night they slept in shifts, their backs to stone and ears tuned to every breeze. Caleb Mercer had forgotten what it felt like to ride with a purpose. Years of self-imposed exile had dulled his instincts, made him slow. But the badge pinned to his shirt, though scratched and tarnished, kept him upright in the saddle. It reminded him that he had a debt to pay. Not to Sarah, not even to the Morrison family, to the children, to the lives that still had a chance. By the second evening, the group camped beneath a scattering of pinyon trees, the fire kept low and quiet. Sarah sat on a rock near the flames, sharpening her knife, the steady rhythm echoing through the dry air. Caleb sat across from her, slowly cleaning his rifle. The silence between them was no longer tense, just tired. "You still think you can fix it?" she asked without looking up. He didn't answer right away. "I know I can't," he finally said. "But I can keep others from paying for what I ran from." She gave a slight nod, not of agreement, but of understanding. Running Elk joined them, crouching beside the fire with a handful of dried meat and hard bread. "The Garrett gang numbers 30, he said. "But we have surprise. We have conviction." Caleb looked to him. "That train is due in the early morning, day after next." "Yes," Running Elk confirmed. "They'll strike when the train stops to refill water. The crew will be distracted. That's when they'll move in. Then we move faster," Caleb said. "We get there before they do." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "And do what, dig a trench around the station?" "No," he said. "We set a trap of our own." The next morning, they cut across a dry riverbed, bypassing a known settlement to avoid trouble. The presence of armed Kiowa warriors would only stir panic, and they couldn't afford delays. The route was rugged, filled with thorny brush and sharp drops, but they made it by sundown, arriving at the edge of Millfield, just as the sky turned amber with dusk. Millfield Station was barely more than a water tower, a supply shack, and a platform. No law, no guards. Just quiet tracks stretching into emptiness. It was perfect for an ambush. The train wouldn't arrive for another day, but already Caleb could feel the tension tightening in his chest. He dismounted and walked toward the platform, boots crunching on dry gravel. He could almost hear the whistle, feel the vibration in the ground, and the panic in young hearts when bullets started flying. He turned back to Sarah. "We're not just protecting cargo," he said. "These kids, they're carrying what's left of someone's hope. Maybe they've lost everything. Maybe this train is the last good thing that'll ever happen to them." Sarah watched him silently. Then she opened the old wooden box she'd carried since Cedar Hollow and pulled something from within. Her father's pocket watch. She handed it to Caleb. "He carried that on him the day you came," she said. "He was winding it when the first shot rang out." Caleb took it carefully, reverently. The silver was tarnished, the glass cracked, but it still ticked. "Don't let it happen again," she said softly. "I won't." He tucked the watch into his coat and turned toward the west, where the sun had just disappeared behind the hills. Tomorrow would be the reckoning, for the Garrett gang, for the children, and for himself. At dawn, the first whistle pierced the horizon, a low, haunting cry that rolled across the prairie like a warning. The children's train was coming. Caleb Mercer stood at the edge of the platform, squinting into the morning light. A soft breeze tugged at the brim of his hat, and the sky above was painted in pale oranges and blues, the kind of sunrise most men missed or forgot to appreciate. But not today. Today was a line in the sand. Behind him, the Kiowa warriors had taken position along the high ridge. Hidden in the rocks and sagebrush, they waited in silence. Bows strung, rifles loaded, eyes sharp. Sarah was kneeling behind a stack of crates near the far end of the station, her rifle trained toward the water tower path. She didn't blink, didn't move. She looked like stone carved by fury and forged by purpose. They had laid the trap overnight, a maze of obstacles hidden beneath dirt and straw. Bottlenecks along the southern trail, kill zones in the dry gulch. Nothing fancy, just enough to tilt the odds away from slaughter. And now, they waited. The train came into view, a long black engine trailing steam and dust, its wheels clattering like distant drums. It slowed as it approached the station, its brakes squealing against the rails. Children's faces peeked through the windows, wide-eyed and unaware. Smiles. Small hands pressed against the glass. Caleb's jaw tightened. He gripped his rifle, and then he saw them. Riders. 30, maybe more, fanned out behind the train's path. They crept in from the west, a cloud of dust, sun-glinted barrels, and dark coats. The Garrett gang. They were splitting into two flanks, circling wide. Same tactic they used in Deadwood Creek. Corner the target. Create confusion. Kill fast. But this time, they weren't the only ones with a plan. Caleb raised his hand, one sharp signal, and the Kiowa warriors vanished into motion. Silent, precise, and without hesitation. A single rifle cracked from the ridge, then another, and another. The first wave of Garrett men fell before they knew they'd been spotted. Horses screamed and reared. One man collapsed into the dirt with a look of pure confusion on his face, as if death had come too early. The gang returned fire wildly, spraying bullets at shadows. But the warriors were already gone, shifting positions with the terrain cutting them down one by one. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a reckoning. Caleb moved toward the train, shielding the children with his body. The conductor opened the door, confused and panicked. "Keep the kids down," Caleb shouted. "Shut every window. Don't open that door again until I say." The conductor nodded and slammed the door shut. Sarah fired from the crate stack, taking down a rider who tried to flank the train from the rear. Her movements were clean, steady, not rage-driven, but controlled. She was no longer chasing vengeance. She was defending life. As the sun rose higher, smoke and gunfire filled the air. Bodies hit the dirt. The Garrett gang fought hard, but they were outmaneuvered, outgunned, and for the first time facing enemies who had nothing left to lose. Caleb found himself face to face with the leader Eli Garrett near the pump station. The man was older now, grizzled and mean-eyed, his pistol already drawn. "Should have stayed in your hole," Sheriff Garrett hissed. Caleb didn't hesitate. One shot, center mass. Garrett fell without a word. The sound of battle faded slowly until only the wind remained. The prairie went still again, and the train was safe. The ground was quiet now. No gunshots, no hoofbeats, no shouting. Just the creak of the windmill and the soft rustle of prairie grass as the breeze returned like it too had been holding its breath. Caleb Mercer stood at the edge of Millfield Station, shoulders heavy beneath the rising sun. The air still smelled of gunpowder and blood. Bodies littered the ground, Garrett's men finally silenced by the justice they'd evaded for years. And yet all Caleb could look at were the children, 43 of them. Some pressed their faces to the glass, again confusion replacing their fear. A few had cried. Others had held on to one another. But none had died. Not this time. The conductor emerged slowly from the train hat, in hand his face pale and grateful. "Whatever this was, thank you," he murmured. Caleb only nodded. He didn't have words left, only wait. Behind him, Sarah Morrison stood alone among the fallen. Her rifle was slung over her shoulder, now her hands clenched tight at her sides. She stared at the distant horizon, where the dust of battle had already begun to settle. Caleb approached, but carefully. She didn't turn as he stepped beside her. "We did it," he said softly. She nodded once. Then, after a long pause, "You remembered who you were?" "No," Caleb answered. "I became the man I should have been." Her eyes flicked to him, unreadable. "That doesn't bring my family back." "I know." Silence again. Not cruel, just honest. "But it saved someone else's," she said. "And that matters." The Kiowa warriors began gathering near the ridgeline, tending to their own. 2 had fallen. Running Elk stood over them with a bowed head, murmuring something Caleb didn't understand, but felt in his chest like prayer. Sarah looked toward them. "They came for justice. Same as me." Caleb took the old pocket watch from his coat, Thomas Morrison's. The glass was cracked, but it still ticked. He handed it to her. She stared at it, fingers trembling slightly. "He used to wind this every morning," she whispered. Said it helped him stay steady. Measured the day in something honest. Caleb nodded. "Then maybe it can start a new one." She closed her hand around it and turned away, wiping at her face before the tears could fall. Later, as the sun climbed higher, the train pulled out of Millfield, headed west with its precious cargo of children. The conductor gave Caleb one last look as the cars rattled past. Not a thank you, not anymore. Just respect. Caleb stood watching long after the last car vanished. The wind picked up again, warm and dry. It carried with it no applause, no cheers, just the faint sound of rails humming toward the future. Sarah mounted her horse. "We part ways here," she said. "You'll be all right?" She gave him a look that said, "I've been all right since the day you left me for dead." Still she softened. "I'll make it." She turned to ride, then paused. "You're not the man I came to kill, Caleb, but you'll never be the hero you once dreamed of being." "I know," he said. "But maybe I can still do some good." She rode off without a word. Caleb remained behind, alone but not lost. He looked down at the badge still pinned to his chest. Then he took it off, held it in his hand. Not as a burden this time, but as a choice, and tucked it away. He wasn't running anymore. Not from Deadwood Creek, not from Catherine's ghost, and not from the man in the mirror. The West wouldn't remember him in stories or statues. But maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't remember him as a coward either. And for Caleb Mercer, that was enough. Weeks passed. The story of the Millfield standoff spread slowly like smoke drifting through canyon towns and campfire whispers. No one told it the same way twice. Some said it was a band of outlaws who turned on each other. Others believed a forgotten sheriff rose from the dead to save a train full of children. But those who knew the truth didn't speak loudly. Justice, real justice, was too sacred to boast about. Caleb Mercer never returned to Cedar Hollow. His small cabin, the pasture, the cattle all left behind. They were remnants of a life built on running, not redemption. And when a man finally stops running, he doesn't return to where he hid. He walks forward. He headed south at first, following the ridges through Apache country, where the sky stretched so wide it could swallow your sins. He slept under stars, ate what he hunted, and listened to the wind. Sometimes he swore he could still hear the sound of that train. Other times, he heard Catherine's laugh, Sarah's words the snap of a Kiowa bowstring. Echoes, memories, wounds that wouldn't fully close. But for the first time in years, he didn't push them away. He carried them. In a dusty border town called Carrizo Flats, he stopped to water his horse and caught sight of a wanted poster flapping in the wind. Not for him, not this time. It was for a man who'd been robbing supply caravans north of Tombstone, leaving children orphaned in his wake. Caleb stared at the poster for a long time. That night, he didn't sleep in a stable or drink alone in the saloon. He asked questions, found a trail, saddled his horse, and kept riding. He wasn't a lawman anymore, not officially. But something had changed in him. He had learned that you don't need a badge to stand between evil and the innocent. You just need the will and the weight of a past that won't let you sleep easy. Somewhere far to the north, Sarah Morrison was doing the same. She'd taken her father's old watch and joined a group helping settle displaced families along the frontier. Word had it she'd put down her rifle at least most days and picked up the habit of writing letters for widows who couldn't read or write. She never signed them Sarah. Just C.M. Catherine Morrison, keeping the memory alive. But healing too. Running Elk and his warriors returned to their land. Their price had not been blood or gold, only a promise. That someone would listen when they spoke again. That the children taken from their people would not be forgotten. That justice wouldn't wear just one face. And as for Caleb, he never stayed in one place too long. But stories began to surface of a gray-eyed man who showed up in dangerous places right when evil thought no one was coming. He wore no star, he spoke little. But when children cried or women screamed or a town turned its back on its own, he stepped forward. Some called him a drifter, others said he was a ghost. But the children he saved, they just called him the man who didn't look away. And maybe that's how legends are born in the West, not with gunfire or glory, but with the quiet footsteps of a man who finally learned to walk toward what's right, instead of away from what he'd done wrong.